Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, anything halfway between, flipped over, reversed, outside those parameters entirely, or remixed from any parts therein. Welcome back to the Integral Stages subseries on education, a topic that I think is arguably the crucial issue underlying the meaning crisis, the meta crisis, and the simultaneous possibility for surviving the 21st century and cultivating an integrative planetary wisdom civilization. No pressure, but today Brad Kershner is going to tell us how to do that, and if it fails, it's on him. Brad's one of my favorite people, one of my peers in the Reconstitution Project, and we interviewed him ages ago on the Integral Stage author series for his book about developmentalism and complexity in education. And more than that, I think he's one of the most balanced, gracious, open-minded, and intellectually considerate people I know. So today, all day, it's Braducation. Hi, Brad.
Hey, brother. So good to see you, Layman.
Too, my friend. Let's start with the embodied particulars. Where are you working right now, and what is its educational philosophy? What do you think its strengths are?
Yeah, so right now I am the head of a Waldorf school in Pennsylvania. I just moved here with my family last year, and so it's a new chapter and a new role for me, and it's a pre-K through 12th grade Waldorf school that's situated on 400 acres of biodynamic farmland. It's really beautiful land out here in Phoenixville, Kimberton, Pennsylvania. And the school's been around for 80 years. It's the second oldest Waldorf school in the country. So it's a rich legacy that I'm sort of taking on and trying to lead into a new future. And there's a lot to say in reflection about Waldorf education in particular. It's a very unique and interesting lineage. I've worked in a lot of different educational contexts. I've worked in, sort of elite progressive independent schools in the Bay Area. I've worked in public schools and charter public schools in urban areas of Boston. I've worked at a Quaker school in North Carolina, and now I'm at a Waldorf school. So it's interesting for me to sort of try to understand Waldorf in the context of the bigger picture of all the different approaches to education that there are. And I don't have a deep background in Steiner or anthroposophy, which Waldorf is based on, but I've been studying and learning a lot over these past few years and have been in dialogue with people who have deep exposure to and reflections about Steiner and anthroposophy and Waldorf. And what's exciting for me, and one of the reasons that I took on the role, is because we really are exploring together as a community, with me sort of facilitating a process of reflection around, what are the potentials for the future of Waldorf education? How should it evolve and innovate? What changes should be made? What is Waldorf education for the 21st century? And in a way, it's a particular subset of that broader question of how should education be changing? How should the future be different than the past? What from our philosophies and approaches should we keep and preserve and integrate, and what do we really need to transcend and negate, is one way of thinking about it. And we're very much in that process of reflection at my school. We refer to it as responsible innovation, really thinking about how do we stay aligned with the core principles and the beautiful, true and good things about Waldorf, and yet really, not be held back by the calcifications and the limits and just the adherence to tradition and norms and ritual. At the same time, integrating the significance of ritual and continuity. So it's a really interesting lineage for me to be diving into. So we could go into that a little bit more, but that's sort of where I'm situated right now and the kind of broad things that I'm thinking about.
I'm really interested in that. I don't know what you'd call it, the first wave of attempts to correct modern public schooling, right? The Waldorf is a part of that. And we inherit, like Montessori, we inherit a number of other what are today maybe old-fashioned and maybe not old-fashioned attempts to correct modern public schooling. We're thinking about a whole new set of changes. There have been more recent experiences and experiments, but are you familiar with other alternative or progressive schooling traditions that are sort of in that same era as Waldorf? Do you have a sense of what were they trying to do, right? What were that first wave of people who were going to fix 19th century American German industrial education? What did they have in common? What did they see as the flaws that really needed to be fixed when they started out the project?
Yeah, so I am. I'm fortunate in that sense. I actually have worked in Montessori schools. I worked in a Montessori school in Berkeley, California for 2 years. I've also worked in Reggio Emilia schools and actually worked in a school that was trying to combine Montessori and Reggio. And then with Quaker education, I sort of have experience in these different forms. And there are some interesting overlaps. And also, of course, I've studied people like Dewey and sort of what he was trying to do in response to a lot of the same forces. So we could go into each a little bit. I mean, an interesting thing specifically about Montessori and Steiner / Waldorf is that, well, first of all, as individuals, like they're really singularly interesting and spiritual / religious individuals. And I think that gets lost. Like if you go back and actually read the writings of Maria Montessori, you're engaging with a very thoughtful religious person who had deep insights into humanity and the potentials for humanity. And it was a very humanitarian sort of loving embrace of like what's possible for children and the kind of love and support that we can offer to children, and a really broad scope and vision in terms of like her vision was actually very much rooted in serving the really underprivileged and the poor and the urban underclasses of Italy, and sort of having this broad humanitarian idea about the human potential of all people and really serving the least among us in ways that are really spiritually and religiously oriented. And similarly, for Steiner, actually started working with factory workers' children in Germany and was a very, very interesting and dynamic individual, which we could barely scratch the surface of. But one of the interesting things about him is both incredibly esoteric and spiritual with a really broad and deep sort of cosmic vision for the potentials of humanity and the sort of arc of evolution and the individual potentials of evolution, and also the sort of species-wide process that we're engaged in. And at the same time, a very down-to-earth and practical-minded person who was very engaged in like the hands-on work of running the school and also architecture and engineering and working with sort of the lower classes and working class people in Germany at that time. So lots of interesting overlaps in terms of their orientation, their vision, and specifically I'll add with Steiner, a very philosophical critique of modernity. So writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he was very critical of modernity and is very prescient about some of the trends that we've seen unfold over the past 100 years in terms of materialism, nihilism. Sort of, he saw himself actually being in response to Nietzsche and Kant, and was very critical of Nietzsche and Kant in the sense of like what they represented for him was actually the seeds of what we could now see as postmodernity. He really saw a lot of this coming and sort of saw the writing on the wall in terms of the direction we were going with a very materialist modernity, and was trying to create an educational environment that would actually uplift people in a sort of spiritual way where we could really understand the full scope of human potential and human history, leading toward a more uplifted future.
So a lot of these first wave educational reform movements seem to have come from charismatic individuals who are arguably like proto-metamodernists, people who are bringing the practical and the metaphysical together with a deep critique of modernity and a deep well of love and compassion, wanting to help people, look after things, create transformations. And I think people who are very integrative in their nature, people who span many different disciplines and genres of cultural activity and have a sense of, in a way, of the ongoing notion of the Renaissance human being, of somebody who integrates many dimensions. So where, I guess, where are we now? Like what have we learned in the last 50 years about systems that learn, whether it's social or cybernetic or the human brain, that those people didn't know? Like what do we understand about the learning process that they might not have known and that may not be well integrated into contemporary schooling yet?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because my mind was going to a place when you were sort of describing who they were. I was thinking about, well, the first thought I had was just how hard it is to be that Renaissance person, that really broad and deep thinker who's sort of an expert generalist, and sort of these educational systems that were created by sort of expert generalists and geniuses of some kind or another. Basically, one thing that we've learned is how hard it is to actually go to scale with that in any meaningful sense, and how almost inevitable it is for things to get watered down and brought down to a lowest common denominator, where people end up not actually embodying the qualities of those founders, but falling into patterns of sort of copying or going through the motions or downward assimilating basically the insights of founders. So that's just one thing that I just want to mention that has definitely happened over these past 100 years, is I think it's hard to keep those visions alive because the process itself of fostering the growth and development of individuals who actually can live up to the ideals of those founders is just such a challenging thing to actually manifest. But the question you asked on the flip side is an interesting one, because I think that on one hand, there is a lot that we've learned, and I think we have fleshed out a lot of helpful specifics and details regarding psychological development, regarding the importance of secure attachment, for instance. But ultimately, it's funny, like my basic intuition is that when I still think today and moving into the future about what in sort of an ideal environment would be for human development, what an ideal educational environment would be, it's not that different from what maybe the ideal of a Dewey or a Steiner or a Montessori would have been. It's still more like we still haven't actually ever, it's not as though we've attained those ideals and now things have changed and we've learned so much more that we actually need new ideals based on all these new things that we've learned. It's actually more been the case that individuals with broad and deep visions over the past thousands of years have seen and understood things that most people still really don't see and understand. And it's almost like, we may have had a conversation about something related to this at some point, in the sense of like, when we think about modernity, and this is actually a relevant point for our world right now, there are many ideals and sort of values and principles and ideas that really came online with a certain force in what we call modernity. And now that we're continuing to go through these cultural epochs and response to those things and react to those things and critique those things, it's not as though we've ever attained them, right? It's not as though the ideals in our Constitution have ever actually been embodied and lived and actualized. So I guess my intuition is that we still need to keep refining and coming back to some of the ideals and ideas that have been presented by people from the past. It's not as though those are not valid anymore because we've learned so much since then.
Yeah, that's a really profound point. It reminds me of that Gandhi quote when he's asked about what he thinks about Western civilization. It's great. Someone should try it. That's the same with modernity. It's the same with a lot of our ideals about education. Is if we actually did them, then we would be in a position to know what needed to be improved. But since we haven't implemented any of them in any real and robust way, we're sort of playing a superficial game with each other.
Yeah, and part of the dynamic there is that it's the tendency to always be on to the next thing and innovating and changing. And it's like we actually keep getting further and further away from some of the deep insights and ideals that we never really actually fully understood. In the name, in some people's minds anyway, in the name of moving beyond them and progress or whatever, we're actually maybe getting further away from some ideals that we would be good to try to return to and understand better.
Yeah. The point you felt moved to make about the watering down of these teachings and systems from their founders, that's really intriguing, because I wonder what you feel is where we have the biggest gap. Is it in the education of children, or is it in the education of educators? Which one are we less good at? Right? Because if there's that watering down process, what it says is that even though we might have a pretty good educational model coming from some of these geniuses, they're not necessarily training their teacher helpers well enough to be able to keep that up at that same level.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer, just because it's so much the case in so many different ways that both of those things are true and many more things are true as well, in terms of like, there's problems at every stage, you know, like we're not on a broad scale allowing young children to grow up in an environment that would be most conducive to their growth and evolution. And we're not allowing sort of older children and adolescents and teenagers to grow up in an environment that's actually best and conducive to their growth and evolution. And we're not educating young adults and aspiring teachers or adults in general to develop really mature, robust understandings of history and their positionality and the age that we're in and human development in order for them to be mature and healthy adults and good teachers. So it's like at every step of the way, we could level a pretty thorough critique in terms of all that we're doing wrong. And that really just speaks to the scope of the problem, is envisioning, you know, some sort of listening society, envisioning some sort of culture where we're actually have a birth to death idea of fostering and supporting human development. Every stage is important. And to what degree do we need a comprehensive, holistic vision that is well distributed and understood by adults and aspiring teachers that we're helping to teach the teachers with, to then have a positive feedback loop that cycles all the way back down to how are we creating a society and culture that actually supports infants and toddlers and young children and old children. And it's just such a chicken and egg sort of issue, in that we're not teaching the teachers well enough, but we're also not raising the babies well enough either.
Yeah, that's a really tough problem to look at. The what is the optimal domestic and life circumstance out of which a person could then be educated? When we look at things, everybody's universal PreK, which is great if that's better than what you're getting at home. But there's a lot of home conditions that could be better than that. So do we focus on trying to get more people into those richer early life environments? And how would we do that? Because that requires changing the entire political economy. Or do we adapt our general education system to people living in malnourished artificial environments, which is where most people are growing up?
Yeah, the universal PreK idea is an interesting thread to pull on to kind of unpack the issue, because I have a lot of background in early childhood education and have been familiar with that sort of conversation and the actual embodied experience of working with young people. And yeah, it's always struck me as deeply misguided but well-intended idea, because the very idea of universal PreK is so taken for granted as being situated within the economy and the society and the bullshit jobs sort of life world that we have. And it's sort of within that world, we have to find a way to kind of raise the floor and make sure that nobody's completely falling through the cracks and having a completely insufficient early childhood. So it's really, the intention is really to raise the floor and make sure that everyone's at least getting something. But it's so far from ideal, and it's so far from the much better situation that many people are already in. It's just not equally distributed in terms of when we think about what we actually want for our own children and for our families, would involve a total rearrangement of economics and money and jobs and work, and how people are, how much time people have to actually raise children. Do we have a child-oriented society versus a jobs-oriented society and a money-making oriented society? So I feel like once we really start thinking about what we want, there's so many implications for all the things that would have to change, which does lead me to think that what might be required to even really make real meaningful progress in raising the sort of floor of what we can hope for every child above some sort of substandard, really lame sort of like Head Start pre-K, situation, would involve something like a basic income, or something where people are actually liberated from selling their labor in bullshit jobs. And I think that is directly tied into how do we unleash the potential and the energy and the time for adult humans to really reorient their priorities and be able to give time and energy to raising children. And it really is about, again, it's tightly coupled how we think about raising children and families versus like public education and the state legislated sort of education of the masses. Like we have to see that always in relationship to individual families and the health of the family. And that's a sort of bringing together of the progressive and the conservative impulses too, right? We have to have a meta-ideological and transpartisan vision for like, how do we honor both of those impulses of the family and of the equitable distribution of resources.
Yeah, there's definitely a situation where people cannot wholly or partially opt out of the workforce in any secure way. So they don't have the luxury to be available to be the teachers of their own children, at least in those early developmental years. And certainly, even if they are present, they don't have the sense of presence that comes from having a little bit more comfort and security and economic depressurization. Mm-hmm. Which, for all the failings of earlier civilizations in terms of their technological and medical well-being, often they were able to be present and educate each other much more directly in some of those basic ways. And I think we overlook the ways in which apparently undirected activity generates expertise in the proto skills that will be needed to be educationally successful down the line. And a lot of that happens very early on in the house, in the playground, in the woods with other kids, all those kind of natural and instinctive activities.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it makes me think of just there's a great integration that it seems like is needed. You know, we can think about the pros and cons of different life worlds or different ways of being in the world, different structures, social structures, cultural structures, family structures, and the pros and cons of, for instance, some pre-industrial societies where maybe there were a lot of benefits, especially in the early childhood period, like the benefits of pre-industrial life for the early child. And yet there's a point at which maybe in terms of the life of the mind and the potential that we have now to sort of keep going in our human development, there were certain sort of capacities and skills that became more widely distributed in a post-industrial society, you know, even if it's for just a subset or an elite. And how do we integrate sort of the healthy early childhood life of a more indigenous or pre-industrial sort of life world, and then integrate the sort of more scholastic, almost medieval modernist, like, you know, university ideal of how do you actually go deep in your learning and your study as you get older, you know, and what sort of economic and cultural substrate would actually enable the integration of those experiences as you move through life?
Yeah, that's a really profound question, how to get that developmental stack in place so that the historical and cultural dimension supports and resonates with the phase that the individual child is going through that needs to be maximized at any given time.
Yeah.
There's another element to it as well, though, which is sort of the natural tendency, maybe I'd call it, of liberal bureaucratic regimes to overreach, to have mission creep in terms of institutionalization. Mm-hmm. One of the things I talked with Jim Rudd about yesterday was the real inefficiency of educational systems, right? That you might be able to start math and reading when you're 13 or 14 and, you know, really pick up speed in a year or two rather than spend a decade slowly getting these skills. Yeah. And I mentioned to him about a book I'd read called The Smartest Kids in the World, where they take American students, this is from 10 years ago or so, they send them for a year overseas to the countries with the best educational results internationally, and they follow exchange kids from those schools coming to America. One of the countries is South Korea, and the woman writing the book talks to the South Korean education minister. How do you get such good results? He says, we have terrible results. Our kids are going to school longer than any other kids in the world, and they're all getting paid private tutoring to get these results. That's extremely inefficient. What we want is more results for less time in the educational institution. And just the idea that putting more people, longer hours, and more days in the institution is inherently more developmental and educational and good for society seems like a real top-down bias from bureaucratic, institutional, kind of technocratic thinking.
Yeah, no, that's a great example and description of the large scale problem of like modern factory model education, and how over the past 50, 100 years, we just keep doubling down on that logic, and we just keep wanting more and more and more, just make the standards harder, increase the hours, make it more rigorous, make kindergarten more like first grade, make first grade more like what second grade. It's just the standards and the pressure and the expectation just keeps getting pushed down to younger and younger ages with really counterproductive results. And a lot of people are feeling that, who are involved in public education, and it manifests in the problem of standardized tests, which can become sort of a focus of the problem. But really, it's not just standardized tests. That's just sort of a proxy for that whole bureaucracy that you're talking to, and the pressurized sort of ever increasing intensity of being in a system that just wants more and more and more and more and more, and is inherently competitive, which is antithetical to an educational environment in a lot of ways. And actually, part of the genius of Waldorf is not falling into that, and really having a comprehensive understanding of, from birth to age 21, really, what does that development look like, and why does it make sense to actually wait? And what we learned from some of the best systems, like in Northern Europe, in some places, and also in Waldorf schools, where actually slower is better, and often later is better, and letting kids be kids is better. And then, between the ages of 7 and 14, starting academic work, but still in a very integrated and holistic way. And really not until 14 to 21 are you sort of bringing online the really academic, more sort of, hyper rational, like linear thought, like former operational coming online, and then responding to that appropriately. So having some sort of developmental sequence in mind is really crucial, and that's been totally lost in that modern bureaucracy that you're talking to. And it's also a really important point, which can be made in several different ways, of like, often the Asian countries that are put on that pedestal of being the most successful, there's a lot of ways in which they're not, actually. And there's a lot of ways in which they see that, and they see the differences between the kind of innovation and creativity that happens in the elite and inequitable system of America. American elites who go to private schools are still actually the best schools in the world. Like, private elite American schools have much better outcomes on many different registers. It's just that in this country, we're so unequally distributed because of inequality, which of course relates to economic inequality. But having a more homogenized, more standardized, more forced bureaucratic approach in order to try to get the kind of standardized test results that some of those Asian countries are getting is definitely not the way to go. But again, what is the feedback loop is, what is the kind of maturity and insight and understanding of human development, of history, of cultural difference that enables that insight, so that the people who are actually having power over educational systems understand in a really deep and common sense way why that's not the right way. And that hasn't happened yet, apparently.
Yeah. It's interesting because you're describing a system where the problems are compounded at sort of all the levels and junction points, which also could be optimistic, which is to say there's lots of places where improvement could be leveraged. Mm-hmm. Maturity is a word that caught my ear there, because one of the ways to think about this is the sort of development of multiple lines of intelligence. And that takes time, and it takes things that are not always obvious, and certainly aren't the same procedures for kids at all different ages. Mm-hmm. It looks like there's an emotional and interpersonal maturity crisis in American schools, and maybe the world's schools. Mm-hmm. And that one of the places we see this is in the crises of the American universities, which are being described as, hysterical or woke or all these sorts of things, which suggest to me that the kids coming in are not emotionally prepared to handle these very sophisticated ideas that they're being exposed to. And they end up sort of running around or coming out into the workforce armed with some really sophisticated linguistic and conceptual tools, but they lack a lot of the basic human emotional development necessary to ground that. Mm-hmm. And that maybe even you could say, like, looking across the news, it's almost like what we're told, at least about the United States and maybe the world, is people seem to be still at a high school level of emotionality. And all of their responses, our politicians, our business leaders are not doing much more than what we would expect to find in a sitcom about high school students.
Yeah.
And so what's going on with the failure of emotional education?
Yeah, it's true. I think we are seeing some manifestations of regression or degeneracy, and definitely like widespread psychopathology. Not that these, things haven't been present in the past, but I think we would of course have to talk about the development and changes in media and social media and our media ecology and the normalization of propaganda. A lot of the underlying elements that, for instance, the Consilience Project is trying to fight against, and that our friend Zach has been talking about a lot, I think are really relevant here in terms of really understanding the widespread influences of this very unprecedented and new environment that we're living in. And again, in a very deep and commonsensical way, we have to see the inevitable influence of environment on psychology and the sort of reverberating feedback loops between the individual, the sense of self and identity, the culture, and the environment, which includes principally media and technology. And the rate of change of our media and technology influence and environment over these past just 20, 30 years is so extreme that, it shouldn't be that hard to really see that there's going to be huge ramifications for the impacts on our collective psyche and our culture. And I think we can see that a lot of those impacts are not healthy and not leading to mature, balanced, integrated individuals. So we have a serious problem here. And I think that's a big piece of it. I mentioned economics and fundamentally shifting our relationship to work and jobs and money and equality. And also, I think another big lever is increasing the health of our media ecology and the ways in which we get information, understand information, the frameworks that we have to interpret, diversity of perspective, and key distinction between how do we get out of this sort of race to the bottom where propaganda as a mode of communication is so normalized, it's almost like young people think that that's just the only way to communicate, as opposed to the difference between an actual pedagogical situation where people are actually earnestly and in good faith seeking truth and inquiry with an earnestness and a humility and an epistemic humility that would allow one to actually be flexible in one's thinking and changing one's perspective based on the input from others, and really seeking with others in a sort of open-minded way the ever-increasing improvement of information and understanding, which is what education is all about. And it's like the world we live in is so fundamentally antithetical to the educational impulse. We are in an anti-educational culture, basically, where the incentivization is to double down, to contract around an identity that's identified with a position, to defend yourself and fight against people who have different perspectives in some sort of, zero-sum default sort of background where that's just what reality is like. So the problems are deep and wide. And I think, which is partly why I have found myself where I have found myself, sort of in a very bucolic farmland, and what I'm hoping can be an island of sanity, because the waves are wild and crashing out there in the ocean of social media.
You're making a good argument for why integrative geniuses of some kind are required to even start to grapple with this. Because like, education, but of course home life, but of course the economy, but of course politics, but of course technology, but of course if all of that has to be addressed all together, it requires a capacity that's extremely uncommon among human beings. And this self-generating complex feedback loop where it's being sourced in all these dimensions is frighteningly huge, right? How do we change the culture? How do we change the media? Well, then we got to change the people who are in charge of that. And all that has to be changed so we can change the education. But if you don't change the education, those people are going to be the same people making the same decisions that create the same educational outcomes. So we're looking for some intervention point, right? And arguably, when you have access to young children, that's a plausible intervention point in this process. So how do we think about the education of kids, right? Given that they're coming out of variously healthy and supportive home lives and ecological and social situations, so that they can, on the one, become the kinds of people who can make the decisions in the future to change these things for the better.
Yeah.
And a big part of that, like you're saying, because some of it's classic, right? Some of it is how do we cultivate in children the basic human skills of innovation and collaboration and resilience and authenticity and sharpness and, you know, all those things that have always made human beings competent and successful. But there's new challenges being unrolled all the time, right? So we're like, how do we also train them to not be totally hacked by a massive, a propagandistic style of universal human communication through digital media and through the absolute fakeability of all information at this point, and the bias skewing of every signal you hear, and the fact that you're hearing so many more signals than our ancestors ever heard before.
Yeah.
That's huge. How do you even begin to think about the education that children need right away to be prepared to receive information in the future without going astray?
Yeah. Well, the good news, brother, is that I actually think it's kind of simple. I mean, the funny thing is, it's like in an environment like the one I'm in at a school, you know, there are relatively simple principles that you want your community to be awake to and aware of and explicit about and trying to be in alignment with. So first of all, the basics in terms of diet, media diet and physical diet, like having basic guidelines around, hey, it makes a lot of sense to limit the media exposure of children, right? Like this should just be a normal, simple, at least intention for any healthy community raising children. There should be very strict limits on how much exposure to social media, especially preteen children, are getting. And then obvious, you know, physical diet, I'd say, is important too. And then in terms of the principles that you want to be following as an educational institution, I mean, maybe I'm, you know, it's admittedly a little bit naive, but it seems somewhat simple once you start to acknowledge some of the things that we've already acknowledged. And once you have a basic awareness of some of the things that are playing out in society and some of the things that are unhealthy, we have to keep orienting children and families and teachers to what's happening in the world, the way that things are playing out, and continually taking a sort of metacognitive or reflective perspective on what's happening in the world so you don't fall into it, right? So like, for instance, the conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and race and gender, I think can be really meaningful leverage points and entry points into creating a healthy culture, but it has to be done in a way where you're starting and reiteratively coming back to the idea that the intention is understanding the conversation in its historical context and understanding how to hold the conversation in a healthy way. And the goal or the focus or the ideal for the educational community is not on any particular content or ideology or truth that community needs to adopt. It's at a more meta level of what would constitute a healthy community. Like, what are the ways that we need to think and listen and talk to each other? What are the qualities of healthy conversation, of non-strategic communication, of empathetic listening, of open-mindedness, you know, of not getting polarized, not falling into either or us versus them dynamics? Like, these are the principles that have to be at the foundation of an educational community. So all we really have to do is be able to get to that post-conventional sort of reflective metacognitive perspective where we're looking at, okay, what are the qualities that have to be present for us to be a healthy community, and keep coming back to those qualities to avoid falling into what is a really dominant tendency, and what I guess on some level seems to be hard for people to avoid, is contraction into an us versus them dynamic, contraction into an ideology combined with an identity that puts one in inherent opposition to other people, right? A contraction into any form of relativism or nihilism. So there's certain things to just kind of watch out for. You can see the unhealthy pathologies and patterns that are sort of taking place. But once we have awareness of those problems, it's sort of insight into those problems that allows one to avoid them, basically. And basically, we're at the point in our social complexity where we have to be grounded in the ability to see and understand the problems, so that we're ever reminding ourselves what those problems are and not to fall into them unconsciously. It's just like, and that becomes the ethos of the educational community. Like, we are a community that is committed to being metacognitive and reflective about the problems in society. We are committed to understanding our community in a historical context, where we sort of understand why and how different perspectives have emerged over time and how they've come into tension with each other. And our goal as an educational community is to be ever engaging in the inquiry of trying to understand these things as best as we can, with the basic principle being you can't solve a problem you don't understand, right? And the goal of any educational community has to be ongoing learning and ever deepening understanding of these issues, as opposed to identity with a ideology or a fixed answer that is inherently in opposition to others. So I just kind of kept saying the same thing over and over there. I just wanted it to be
no, I'm glad you did, because there's a beautiful, very powerful idea in there.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that we have a natural tendency in contemporary societies to think we need to sort of do a homogenous top-down minimum standards enforcement thing, rather than distributing the decision-making about education into local areas, because and that's problematic, because you need a community and you need an institution that can be self-correcting, collaborative, metacognitive in its analysis and response to what's happening at the moment, so that it can constantly update itself. And it needs some basic principles to steer that, like you're saying, right? We know if we sway into nihilism or something like that, we're off course. We have some basic idea if we're steering well or not. And we have some ability to think about what we're doing and what's going on, and how we can get the kinds of results we want, facing the kinds of crises we want, which are constantly changing and unfolding. So it has to be more like the brain, more like a self-correcting, self-evolving swarm of some kind.
Yeah. And it has to be process oriented. You know, we have to make just some key distinctions between the health of the process and an open-endedness and open-mindedness about almost everything else, you know. And whereas if we focus on a product or an endpoint, it distorts and disrupts the process.
Well, in terms of an endpoint, though, I mean, not an endpoint exactly. And I think you're absolutely right. It has to be process oriented. And I think that kind of thinking intrinsically comes along with the kind of metacognition you're describing. And this is a weird question, given that education, the definition of education, should maybe expanded to a lifelong thing that encompasses many areas of society other than schools. But what's the goal? Like, at what point do you look at some people who've come out of some educational process and say, it's working, what we're doing? Like, you could have this potentially a system, a collaborative educational community that's trying to update itself. At what point does it know it's working or not? Where's the, if we say some federal standard of teaching to the test of metrics of a certain kind of cognition is really not an adequate way to evaluate whether the system is working or not, then what is? What are you looking for in young adults, say, that lets you know that the educational system you're involved in is actually succeeding?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely qualities that we can associate with self-actualization, and the description, the qualitative description of a relatively healthy, well-adjusted, mature, self-actualized human being, would be the goal. The goal is human development and ongoing development, and being oriented toward unending growth and development. So in a nutshell, that's it. It's that shift from like even if, if the assumption behind, I'm not saying this is your assumption, if the assumption behind a question like that is that it has to be some concrete, quantitative, metric that can then be compared and judged hierarchically, that's already missing it. It has to be a qualitative, sort of humanistic, development-oriented, ongoing, learning-oriented conception of what it's all about. It's this never-ending process, and orienting people to what degree is a teenager or a young adult oriented toward ongoing learning? To what degree do they actually see their lives as a journey of self-discovery and service, right? To what degree are people oriented towards service?
They are embodied as agents of the educational process they've received, so that they are like an ongoing school themselves.
Yeah.
We put school into them, and now they are school. So what we want to verify is that they can continue to learn independently, essentially. Yeah, or
exactly. And to what degree, and in a slightly maybe more concrete way, to what degree are, by the time someone is a young adult, to what degree are they post-conventional as opposed to conventional? Meaning, to what degree are they actively engaged in the process of trying to figure out how to make things better, how to understand the way the world works and what's happening so as to be of service to that world and others, versus being locked in a very conventional mind state of trying to simply be successful within the game as it's currently being played. Are we totally in game acceptance and just trying to win the game? Or are we actually moving towards some sort of game change where we understand the social game, but we're actually trying to make it better?
This makes me a little bit curious about your ongoing learning and development, because I'm really intrigued by trend lines. Like, one thing they say is people who study the environment become more worried about the environment, and people who study nuclear power deeply very often become less worried about nuclear power than they originally were. So how do things change over time? And I wonder how your takes are changing. Like, since you wrote your book on education, what have you become more certain about that's in that book? What would you emphasize things differently? Where are you now? Like, do you sense a direction or a drift in your own understanding?
Yeah. I mean, the book is, an analysis of what's happening in urban schools, and then reflecting, using complexity theory and integral theory on basically what do we need to understand to really understand what's happening in schools. And that involves understanding complexity, understanding the influence of society on schools, and understanding developmental psychology. And I'd say where I'm moving, all of that I think is valid and important. Where I'm moving really is in response to the world. So for me, what comes up is just really, how has the world changed in the past 2 years? And a big way that the world is changing, or something that our society seems to be going through right now, is this new iteration of culture war that's revolving around the pandemic and transitions in norms around how we think about and talk about the social constructions of race and gender. And it's been interesting for me to really try to integrate what's happening in the world on those fronts from different perspectives, and then land in a place where I feel like I can help other people understand what's going on in a way that enables them to actually be open to loving relationship with other people who may have a different experience or a different understanding or perception or perspective on these issues, and really using those very divisive, polarizing issues as possibilities for actually cultural healing. So I'm becoming, more than I could have anticipated, really leaning into some of those difficult topics with friends and family and with my school community, oriented toward the kind of health and healing that needs to happen in our society right now in a way that feels very different than what I think I or others were feeling, say, 5 years ago.
When I talked to Jim Wright yesterday, the question of aggression came up quite a bit, and he's an older guy. His schooling was quite a ways back, but he was very concerned about the necessity, especially in boys, for unsupervised aggressive play of certain kinds, and the ability to cooperate with and work with people who you're fighting in a way, and how that later becomes a capacity to work with and get along with people who you strongly disagree with. And if people don't get to play those out in the early natural forms where we have this inbuilt complexity on how to do that, then we might end up in a position where we don't know how to work with or get along with or like people that are our enemies or hold different positions than us. And that might be part of the roots of our current polarization problem, in addition to all the other sources of our polarization problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that being a root of the problem, but there's definitely a good point and insight there. And I would agree in general. And it's actually another one of the ways that Waldorf education is sort of ahead of the curve by being behind it, in that we very much allow more room and more slack for young children to engage in sort of playful, even roughhouse ways. It also ties in interesting, probably don't want to go down this road, but it does tie in interestingly to the ways in which biological and maybe even more than biological differences between boys and girls do show up really pretty consistently in terms of kinds of aggression that manifest in young boys and the kinds of play that young boys engage in cross-culturally, frankly. And you definitely see that. And it's sort of understanding, acknowledging, allowing, and integrating those kinds of truths and those kinds of patterns in a arc of development that allows those things to be okay and to be developmentally appropriate within certain ranges of time is part of what would be involved and included in having just a healthy, coherent, comprehensive understanding of human development and education. So definitely, I would agree and give Jim a thumbs up in terms of allowing and enabling and scaffolding in some ways free play, rough play, outside play for all children. But we definitely do see that manifesting in young boys, and the inhibition and suppression and repression of that is a pretty straightforward, not good thing in a lot of ways.
I know we've been talking about the educational community as metacognitively adaptive to what's arising, but there's also an element to all education that forecasts the future, right? Whether it's, the 19th century idea that we're going to need a lot of factory workers, or a kind of late 20th century idea that we're going to need a lot of computer programmers. We have a sense of, if the future is going to be like this in the next generation, what do we need a lot of? What should we encourage in our educational? If we can skew it some way, then maybe we should, to get more of what we're going to need. But we're facing a situation now of extreme ambiguity and uncertainty in our predicting capacity. If we try to imagine the mid 21st century, we go, well, you've got climate change and biodiversity and AI and deep fakes and gene splicing and the Pentagon acknowledging UFOs. You're like, the number of strange, potentially transformative, radical things coming together in the 21st century are so peculiar, and their interactions are so unpredictable that you end up with this hugely uncertain future of almost certain destabilizations and disruptions of various kinds. How do we prepare for that? If that's the future that kids are almost certainly going to be inhabiting, what skill sets do they need in order to thrive in that environment?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a one-size-fits-all answer, which kind of ties back into the problems of the modern bureaucratic public education system and the sort of increasing complexity of that system, and the way in which, for a lot of the reasons that you just stated, it seems like we're moving toward a sort of destabilization. And I think perhaps what might need to happen is a sort of release of complexity, sort of in Benita's terms of like, we can't just keep getting more and more, intense, and like we can't just from the top down scale like an adequate public education system. We actually need to in some ways release the pressure on that drive and allow some sort of decentralization to happen. Now, in that process of destabilization and decentralization and experimentation and innovation, I certainly wouldn't expect that it's going to flower into a ubiquity of amazing educational scenarios. That's just not what's going to happen. But there are going to be some interesting and some beautiful educational scenarios that some people come up with. You know, and me, like right now, just as an individual, I'm engaged sort of in 4 different projects right now that are sort of looking ahead at, okay, what are some things that we can do in the short term, near future that relate to education and creating new educational possibilities for people that are very different than the status quo. So there's going to be lots of innovation and ideas. And I think lots of people trying to create, you know, islands of sanity and coherence while things potentially destabilize and start to break down.
You said an interesting thing a few minutes ago about sort of recognizing cross-cultural gender differences that are biological and possibly more than biological. So how do we treat identity in education? It's really interesting because on the one hand, you have to accept where there are structural differences and processing differences among different types of people and also different backgrounds that come into this. At the same time, we see part of the culture war is clearly that people get locked down into identity patterns. And I've seen some interesting studies that say, like, if girls have to identify that they're girls, like put male or female at the top of the math test, they do worse on the math test than they would otherwise do because they subconsciously immediately fall into their own stereotypes about their identity category rather than behaving as an intelligent individual.
Yeah.
So there's some real detriments from a sense of identity. And yet there's some real detriments to not paying any attention to the different identities that are in play. What's your approach to sort of optimizing that dichotomy?
Yeah. Well, that's a really big, complex question. I mean, the development of healthy identity, what are the forms of healthy identity? What are the ways in which you have to become somebody before you can become nobody without losing sight of the benefits of becoming nobody? And maybe even having that being an overarching goal of self-actualization would be self-disintegration. But I think one thing to think about is, we have to look, like I said, we have to look at the problems, right? And I think part of creating an educational community is being oriented toward understanding the problems that we're facing as clearly as possible. And right now, one of the problems we're facing is definitely ways in which identity formation is being manipulated and unfortunately co-constructed by really unhealthy informational technological media environments, and how basically the very strategic and propagandistic manipulation of information in media is actually having a real impact on the self-construction and identity construction of young people. And that whole situation is being driven by a profit motive, not by the motive of helping people actually develop healthy identity. And a sort of breakdown of, you know, what, like the sort of fragmented pluralism that we're in right now, where there's a lot of confusion and disorientation and lack of sort of coherent overarching meta narrative that people can kind of have faith and trust in. I think in some ways we can also see is leading to the sort of collapsing of identity, where people feel like you're almost more having to rely on your subjective emotions and the impressions that you have to like try to shape an identity. But then when that isn't reflected back to you by society in the way that you want, then you feel like you're a victim and there's a fragility there. So there's lots of things to sort of unpack in terms of what the problems are in terms of how young people are forging identities nowadays. And there's also something to be said for the relationship between like your intrapersonal relationships and your interpersonal relationships, right? So it's like, how do we learn to have different aspects of ourself that we can be sort of in relationship to and be metacognitive about, and understand that we can be fluid and flexible in like, yes, you know, in terms of how I express myself, in terms of my gender, my connection to my family, how I present, you know, in terms of like my race and ethnicity, where I come from, my local subculture, what music I listen to, you know, there's like what country I'm from, what state I'm from, you know, there's so many layers to our identity. And how do we allow all of that to just be flexible and fluid and sort of open and in a process of change and growth? And then how does that relate to how we also have openness and fluidity and understanding and empathy and compassion and how we relate to other people? I think those things are really really importantly connected. And the last thing I'll say there is the importance of weaving into education practices that actually facilitate metacognition and facilitate that sort of becoming more aware of your self-constructions, more aware of the workings of your mind. Some sort of meditative practices basically have to actually be baked in to education at this point, is maybe the short answer.
Yeah, that's so two questions, and you touched on one of them already, but how explicit then does the multiplicity of the self, or the plural modal nature of the psyche, need to be in the school system, right? Does it need to be a really upfront organizing principle for education? And then the other one is, I know you said meditation, but what else? What are the skills that train metacognition?
Yeah, I don't know to what degree a certain model of the psyche, or a certain sort of metapsychology, has to be explicitly a part of education. Although I don't see how it could hurt. I just don't know if it's necessary, just because, again, we're always stuck in this problem of how sophisticated does our approach need to be, to the extent that it might become a barrier for enough people having access to it and understanding it to be able to embody and enact it, right? Like, how simple can we make things so that it's actually something that teachers and parents can understand on a broad scale? So I'd say keeping it as simple as possible is a basic principle. So probably not, some particular metapsychology or something, but something as simple as coming back to and reinforcing and reiterating these basic principles of the importance of metacognition, the importance of fluidity and flexibility and openness in terms of how we understand ourselves, the kinds of identities we can create, the overlapping, like the very idea of having multiple fluid overlapping identities, and the problems of being contracted around a particular sort of abstract category, the problems of sort of reifying a particular categorization of identity, the problems of actually over-identifying with a particular characteristic or social construction, such as race or gender. Like, there are problems with that. And I think we do need to be able to talk in common sense ways about the problems of that. But I would say that in itself might be an answer to the second question. Like, not only do we need to engage in normalizing silence and stillness at the very least, and I can think of, even having worked in Quaker schools, without much explicit instruction in meditation, at least normalizing silence and stillness for all humans every single day is a pretty good start. We need time. We need time in silence. We need time to look at and just watch our thoughts and our interior experience. We need times of stillness and silence, which we don't have enough of, right? We need time for introspection. So just normalizing that and building that into our children's day, I think, is important. And then the second thing would be that, again, it's whether it's looking at what's going on in the world or looking at these patterns as they manifest in ourselves, we have to be engaged in the practice of looking at the kinds of problems that arise when we fall into certain traps of the mind, this would be the problem with actually, can we see the problem with maybe what happens when a group of people all identify as one thing in inherent opposition to other people who have a different identity? Gee, kids, what could go wrong if you do that? We have to be thinking about those kinds of things because it's what's happening.
Your invocation of stillness and silence, I think, is really profound there. I've had, in my theorizing and teaching of different meditation and inner techniques, people often go, well, how would I do this for my kids when they're really young? How do you get them to meditate? I'm like, you don't have to control their interior, right? Mm-hmm. Just to sit there quietly in a meditation posture of some kind is already going to do 80% of the work. It changes the neurophysiology. It gives them the opportunity for introspection. It sets them up for somewhere down the road where they start to bring in intentional approaches to their own attention. But they don't need to do that right away. Just starting by having that space, I think, is hugely important interpersonally, cognitively, and even physiologically.
Yeah, and to not and to keep it simple, you know, especially at young ages. Like it's easy as an adult who finds the benefits of something like meditation to kind of overdo it, and but you still got to just let kids be kids. I mean, even the Dalai Lama, I remember him saying, like, even with the really rigorous monastic training that he had from a young child, he didn't really get it or feel any benefits of it until he was a teenager. You know, it's like it's not really until you're a teenager that you might have certain capacities to really be understanding and appreciating it for yourself. So the main thing you want to do prior to that is to not make them averse to it, right? Not to create a reaction against it by forcing it. You know, same with reading and learning in general. Like becoming a person who loves to read is much more important than forcing kids to read any particular thing.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to physical health in a lot of respects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You might get to an age where you think, oh, I really want to get into this sport or this activity, or I understand now that I need a more deliberate health regime. But little kids don't need that. They do still need to be physically healthy. They need to move and oxygenate and run around, but it doesn't have to be structured because they don't really even have the equipment to individually understand how this might be an important part of their life.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I'd say that's probably the one I've struggled with the most as a parent, is how to create those healthy boundaries while not creating the forbidden fruit of processed sugar, for instance, not making it this repressed, denied thing. And yet, like, it's basically poison. So why would I be giving it to my child? And it's hard. And when you get into the intricacies and delicacies of that experientially as a parent, you start to realize how nuanced and delicate and fragile the educational process is. Like this dance that we're in with young people to help nurture and foster and support and facilitate. And yet there are so many built-in drives for them to be reactive and to be, not just going along with the program and not just telling you, not just doing what you tell them to do, and it's like, how do you actually foster sovereignty and independence and autonomy, and yet not just have it be a free-for-all? It's a delicate dance. It's definitely more of an art than a science, which is all the more reason why we have to make it less bureaucratic and top-down and standardized.
Yeah, it's very fluctuant and flexible. And I think something's happened in the last couple generations where there's been a sense of trying to block some of the inherited top-down disciplinary structures. And we still know we need some of those things, and striking that balance between, on the one hand, a very contemporary spirit of going, hey, we don't know the answers and we don't want to just trample the organic thing. And frankly, we're going to need these kids very quickly to become our partners in figuring out what the answers might be. But at the same time, I've got to draw some lines for them so they have a scaffolding to play with. Otherwise, they're not going to be very competent partners in helping us figure out what the answers are.
Yeah, no, it's a really challenging integration. And it actually is, at another scale, it's a version of that sort of great integration that needs to happen. And again, it's actually something that Waldorf does pretty well in terms of acknowledging and integrating the importance of structure and clarity and authority, especially for young children. Like there's the idea that children really want and need structure and guidance, and they need to know the adults are in charge and are okay. And there's a huge problematic tendency more recently where parents put way too much on kids, like asking young children like what they want and giving them lots of choices. And it's totally overwhelming and confusing and signaling to kids that adults don't know what the hell they're doing. And the adults are supposed to actually know what they're doing and are supposed to actually allow children to be children and feel like they're in a safe and loving and supportive environment where they don't have the stresses and strains of the world on their shoulders. And we've really lost sight of some of those basic insights. And there's a way in which, again, less is often more, slower is often better, waiting is often better, not rushing the developmental process is often better. And if there's probably one big change we could make in terms of parenting and education when it comes to like teenagers and below, it would be doing less, exposing less, slowing down, just not putting all the weight and stress of the world in front of our kids' face and letting them know that we got this. It's going to be okay. And even if we're lying at some level, even if we don't fully believe it ourselves, that's a pretty benevolent projection to sort of let your kids know that everything's okay and they're safe.
the way of saying you don't have to handle this right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They shouldn't even they don't need to be aware of what are the things that, we have to handle either.
Thinking about, you strike me as a socially lucky person in the sense of, I think, probably in your private life and in your work environments and in your online dealings, you run into a lot of people who are smart, who you respect, who you think are good citizens and socially productive and have a sense of where the world should go or could be better. And I'm curious if you have an overall sense of what those people are like. When you think about the smart people you like, who you respect, is there anything in common in their approach to learning and their educational backgrounds? Do you have a sense of like, oh, these people maybe all do this, and I think that's turned out pretty well?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question because it's true, and it makes me feel really grateful and good. But it also makes me think about, just the diversity of the people that I know and love and who inspire me. And it's what comes to mind is just that the importance of not realizing that you can't overgeneralize, or again, you can't overstandardize. You can't say it's hard to point to a causal pattern in terms of inputs. And there's so many examples of like post-traumatic growth, for instance. It's certainly not people who grew up on Easy Street who necessarily end up with the best skills and capacities. So just that, I think, is worth noting. Of there's so many roads to get far along on the path. There's so many places to start from. But in terms of the general qualities and characteristics that people end up with and sort of bring onto line in their adult life, I mean, they're not that hard to describe. I think, again, sort of like when we were thinking about what would be the ideal or the goal of education, what kinds of qualities do we want in people? We want people who are open-minded, who are engaged in non-strategic communication, who have some epistemic humility, who are genuinely just beyond certain unconscious patterns of, narcissistic self-reference, and are genuinely actually interested in and oriented toward other people. There's just basic qualities of humility and empathy that are the most important things. And when I think of too, not only diversity of starting points, but diversity of cognitive capacity. Like, not everyone who I would sort of bring to mind in that general statement that you made is necessarily reading the same books or interested in the same things. I'm blessed to have a lot of friends who are artists and musicians. And when I was living in New York and San Francisco at different times in my 20s, I was in communities that were not necessarily intellectual communities. That was sort of my thing. I was like the outlier philosopher in a group of like more artistic and musically minded people, and then somewhat like spiritually minded people, but who weren't like reading integral theory and all that stuff. And most of my best friends throughout my life actually haven't been very intellectual. So that's just important to note too. It's not, I think, something that happens in online communities is you and I are definitely connected to very, hyper intelligent and cognitive and linguistic and academic types who are interested in reading a lot of the same books and increasing our understanding of what's going on in the world. And that's beautiful and good, but it's really important to stay grounded in relationship with people who are not in those literary academic worlds, but who are very much grounded in empathy and love and understanding and humility, and not falling into unconscious patterns of ideology, warfare, and polarization.
On the education series recently, I talked to Michael Schwartz and Zach Schlosser, and one of the things, it was about sort of aesthetics in education, which can be approached from several different angles. But I guess the question is our schools sexy enough? I mean, do we foreground aesthetics and sensory experience adequately enough as part of our basic interface with information?
Yeah, definitely not in public schools that I've been in. And again, it's another way I could say Waldorf is really way ahead of the norm by being grounded in sort of older ideas of aesthetics and sort of almost Renaissance-like integration of the arts and the humanities and beauty and color and doing a lot of art with children, and not only in various different kinds of art: woodworking, metalworking, painting, chalk, drawing, clay, fiber arts. Like, there's so many different kinds of arts that are integrated into into a comprehensive curriculum like Waldorf curriculum. And that's very much lacking in public education right now, and in most private schools as well. We're so hyper-focused. Again, we're so much caught into being in response to this bureaucratic, modernist pressure, top-down system, which is very specialized, very fragmented, and having a more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach, I think, is related to also having an approach that integrates the arts more, and in integrating the arts more, being awake to the importance of beauty and aesthetics, and physical activity too, like being outside, having lots of movement time. Yeah, that's a big entry point into understanding a lot of what's wrong in public education.
Yeah, I have a kind of worry that a gap is going to open increasingly between public education and what we are attuned to, both in the historical sense of, just because there was no other way in human history, we did a lot of things very sensorily, very engaged, and very often those are beautiful environments because they can't help but be beautiful when they're embedded in nature and involved craft work in our community and things like that. So we sort of ancestrally are predisposed toward that on the one hand. And on the other hand, our digital interfaces, which are the basic access to information now, are seductive, customized, design theoried, right? So that from both ends, we're set up to look for aesthetic patterns in order to engage with education. And if in the middle you have an educational institution that's not very focused on that even if you have a good teacher and a good course, it's still a really ugly room in a really ugly building, then aren't people naturally going to be drifting away from that somehow because it's not their ancient or contemporary means of accessing understanding?
Yeah, no, that's an important point too, because it leads me to think about the draw toward the metaverse and VR and IR, and just there's some people that are really convinced that there's this inevitable shit that's about to happen where billions of people are going to be spending their time in alternate reality and in virtual reality. And I think what you just said might be sort of speaking to one of the underlying causes of that, which for me feels unhealthy. It doesn't feel like the utopia that I envision, and I think it's a little bit worrying. And it, yeah. So what you just said speaks to maybe having empathy and understanding for why maybe part of that draw is there. There's something like we want more beauty, and I read something recently that was describing, in sort of generalized terms, like the kind of, maybe young male who tends to be drawn to spending a lot of time in VR and AR, and which feeds back to talking about bullshit jobs and like the meaninglessness of just work and social life for a lot of young people now, where it's like if you have a crappy reality, you're going to be more drawn to actually creating a really interesting and dynamic and beautiful virtual reality where your positionality is very different in that alternate reality. And I would think it would be a really obvious thing that we would see that as a problem and as a concern, and that we would be totally devoted to helping to make our reality more beautiful and more meaningful, and to uplift people's positionality in reality, as opposed to creating more beautiful virtual alternatives.
I completely agree. I think we need to really take that element seriously in order to bring people here and together. Otherwise, they are going to drift into these spaces where they can supplement that need somewhere else. And it's not just the obvious danger that those are unreal, depersonalized, disembodied spaces, but they are obviously the most vulnerable to predatory platforms, corporations, and systems who are setting those up to harvest you, not to be of service to you.
Yeah, man, exactly. That's one of the big things that we're going to be facing, and we're going to be having to help, again, like everyone, come to some hopefully broad shared understanding about what we want and what we want to avoid.
I recently heard, I think it was Eric Weinstein, talk about how we discuss learning disabilities, but we don't discuss teaching disabilities.
Mm.
And I'm curious from your point of view, what you think, what holds teachers back from being as good as they could be or would like to be?
Well, two big things. One is just sort of what we've already been talking about in terms of just the inherent problem of scaling human development and maturity and who's teaching the teachers. I mean, it's just an inherently difficult thing to have, tens of millions of awesome teachers. That's just, there is no easy way to do that. It's a slow process of human evolution, basically, and regression. But then more concretely, I think there are very concrete and unfortunate things that are happening that don't need to happen, which would improve a lot. But again, it feeds back to the sort of modern bureaucracy of public education. My work I was a public school principal for a few years, and also did research in public schools for a few years. And yet the mind-numbing and mind-blowing ways in which the system sort of works against the best intentions of educators is really disheartening and depressing. And it has to do with lack of autonomy and lack of sovereignty. We do not respect teachers as professionals. We don't treat them as professionals. We don't give them autonomy. A lot of our modern educational bureaucracy has become a very scripted, confining, top-down controlling program to basically take the sovereignty and autonomy and creativity away from teachers. And the biggest difference that I've seen in the public schools that I've worked at and the private schools that I've worked at is respect for the creativity and autonomy and professionalism of the teacher and of the school leader. Principals in public schools are also very constrained and very controlled and have a lot of pressure on them to manipulate particular outcomes. And that pressure to manipulate outcomes disrupts process and makes them crack down and increase pressure and decrease freedom for teachers. And that trickles down and decreases the creativity and autonomy of students. So we really have to release the pressure valve. We have to trust people. We have to actually focus much more on the inputs into teaching than the outputs, because the focus on the outputs, again, has led to a stifling at every step of the way in terms of a really dysfunctional kind of backwards planning, where we're trying to control every step of the process in order to get to the outcome we want. And every step of control actually inhibits the potential of the human beings at that level to actually unleash whatever potential they have to actually make the best of the situation. So it's a very dysfunctional top-down bureaucracy that we're stuck in. And you see not only the negative outcomes in the experience of kids and students in classrooms, but you also see it in the really toxic turnover and burnout factories that schools are. The public schools I worked at were filled every year with young, idealistic teachers who would last 2 or 3 years and then move on to something else because the system just wasn't feeding their soul. If we could just make it less soul crushing and a little bit more loving and respectful, we go a long way, actually. It's not that hard. That's the thing. There's a lot of ways of critiquing education or thinking about how different things could be, or coming up with vastly alternative, visions for education. If we actually just stopped doing the worst stuff to people, it could be a lot better than it is.
I'm imagining protesters with signs that say, just make it a little less soul crushing.
Yeah, it would go a long way. It would go a long way. And it's really sad. It's funny how the charter school movement is a great example of how the incentives of the sort of soul crushing bureaucracy eat any idea and just turn it into a reflection of itself for its own means. The idea of charter schools actually came from progressive educators, very much in alignment with the things that I'm talking about, of wanting educators and school leaders to have more autonomy and to have more sovereignty and to be empowered. And what's happened is that's been totally enveloped by the hyper-competitive, sort of top-down, over-quantified educational system, where it's really just pitted charter schools in competition against non-charter schools, where now it's actually increased the pressure for each of those different sectors to actually manipulate their outcomes by any means necessary, even to the point of cheating and manipulating scores. and it's just been a race to the bottom, and the very seed of the idea of autonomy and freedom and creativity has totally been lost. It's tragic. It's very tragic.
I'm curious how much of this is tied into the economic incentive structure and how we financialize these things. If it's public schools relating to the government, if it's private schools trying to get money from people, if it's the famous student debt crisis with post-secondary education. I had a great talk with Creston Davis recently from the Global Center for Advanced Studies. They're really trying to leverage cryptocurrency and some other things to create a debt-free program, because in their mind, you can make all the changes you want. And if you don't change the financing, you're going to end up with the same problem, some version of the same problematic limitation structures. Like, so how big a deal is the way schools are getting their money? And what are some of the ways we could make progress in that regard?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a big part of it. And there's subsets of the problem at different levels. So like if you look at higher education, there's definitely a big problem with the really runaway inflation, in a way, of like the cost of higher education, the administrative sort of ballooning of higher education. It's just like higher education economically doesn't make any sense. It feels like it's poised for some sort of crash. The amount of debt that people are taking on, myself included, is really ridiculous and absurd. So that, without going into that too much, that's definitely an unsustainable system that feels like it might break down. The question pre-K through 12 is a little bit different. It's shifting it to looking at really how to make it more equal, I think. There's obviously an inequality between public and private. But at this point, we'd have to really fundamentally reorient the logic of public education to sort of make it more of an attractor, to take away the very, I think, benign incentive that people who can access private education want it. What I'm saying is the reason people want private education are very valid and justified, because the problems of public education are very real. So we'd have to sort of fix that, which doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with economics. But just in terms of looking at public education, we have the question of equality. And there's also sort of a subset of why is the funding for public education not equal and equitable? And that, again, I think is a more potentially resolvable issue. For instance, one sort of obvious thing is that schools should not be funded based on property taxes. That's just a way of exacerbating and reinforcing inequality. And yet that is a dominant logic in the funding of public education. So having a much more straightforward, equitable funding of public education, I think, is a very common sense and sort of no-brainer thing to do. And yet, of course, it hasn't happened because those who are benefiting from the system have the incentivization to not change it. But again, that's the kind of thing where it's like it's relatively low-hanging fruit. You could envision that something like that could be enacted, where we at least make public education funding more equitable. But that, as a lever of change, I think will actually be pretty small. I think it's just the right thing to do, and it's kind of obvious, but it won't fundamentally change all the problems that we've been talking about public education. It would just distribute the illogic of public education bureaucracy more equitably, which is not really the answer.
Teaching about society and history is a very fraught dimension in the world today. And I've got, sort of two things on my mind. One is, negotiating between whatever critical race theory means to people, whether it has anything to do with that as a philosophy or not, and something like what I've been calling inspirational race theory, right? The idea of like, are we trying to correct inadequate and caricatured and bias generating versions of history by teaching ourselves to be more skeptical and critical about our stories and about our sense of mythic attachment to history? Or do we want to have a broader and more diverse, but still somewhat heroic and legendary based teaching of history? So because that's appropriate to children and appropriate to building a shared national spirit. Like, it's one thing to say, well, look, we're massively exaggerating the role played by genocidal white men, versus saying, here, kids, here was an awesome Latino woman who really helped this country, and look at her exciting life. Those are slightly different approaches.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, there's a basic question about stereotypes and caricatures, because I think we kind of take for granted that stereotypes and caricatures are problematic, and yet it's very natural to human beings, and especially to children, to think in these simplified cartoons. And do we have to be careful about teaching to our cartoon tendency, or do we have to wisely and skillfully make use of, but also accept that we do think and feel in stereotypes and cartoons, and that's not necessarily a problem and limitation if it's done in a healthy way? I mean, that's a whole cluster of things. But
both sides of both of those contrasts contain truths that need to be integrated. The question is when and how, right? And I think there may be relatively straightforward developmental timing differences in some of those contrasts. So it's not really an either or, it's more of a when. Because, for instance, this sort of uplifting, heroic, individual pedestal approach, which can easily be critiqued, is actually maybe potentially developmentally appropriate for young children. Young people actually do need models to imitate and to idealize and to want to live up to. There are very natural characteristics for certain developmental stages, especially think of late elementary school. You see kids obsessed with the Guinness Book of World Records, and wanting to learn about interesting characters. And we do need healthy models and ideals, and that there is an appropriateness to that. And the sort of postmodern mind, post-adolescent critique of that is only appropriate in the context of a certain developmental sequence when that becomes appropriate to critique that. But that doesn't mean that everything you did as a child was wrong. It means that now you then maybe move into the next stage, which was the other side of the contrast you pointed to, of showing how we should actually be a little bit more skeptical and a little bit more critical of perhaps stereotypes and past idealizations of individuals, and just start to complexify things. But hopefully without losing sight of the sequential relevance and importance and okayness of some of those oversimplifications and abstractions. And I think, again, we're lacking on a wide scale, we're lacking a comprehensive, coherent understanding of developmental sequence, of this way that things should, and in some ways have to go through stages. And there's just different timing. The way you teach young children is different than the way you teach middle-aged children, is different than the kinds of critical capacities that should come online in young adulthood. And how do we get to the point where that is a taken for granted and obvious thing that adults understand, right? How do we get to the point where all parents and educators take what I'm saying now as obvious and doesn't need to be actually explained, so that we can get out of some of those either or contrasts and move more toward continually refining and improving the timing of how our curriculum unfolds?
It's very reassuring when you say there might be simple, practical solutions. I like that. This notion of bringing in developmental thought is really profound, right? Because the learning, the task demands of the niche of learning are different for people at different phases, right? We can't treat them all homogenously. And then the question becomes, how do we adjudicate what phase they're in? And partly that's just having empowered, sovereign, capable, good-hearted teachers on the spot to make that assessment. But what we do right now, which is taken for granted, but it's really perverse, is to just do it by age cohorts. Right, that you're likely to be in this stage, and it's not totally dumb, because you are more likely to be at a certain developmental stage at a certain age, but there's no one-to-one correlation between those things. Right? How big a problem do you think it is that we just have this idea of advancing people by annual grade levels?
Yeah, I think it's a very different question from birth to the teen years than it is post-teen years. I think it gets, talking about development from adolescence and beyond is much more complicated, because where someone's at in any particular skill or capacity becomes less and less coupled with their age over time. I think that thinking about children I'm personally not inclined to over problematize age cohorts because the patterns are so strong. And I think the developmental sequences from birth to say 14, 15, there's always going to be a range. Every individual is an exception to every rule because rules don't apply to individuals. They apply to patterns and groups in that sense. But still, the patterns are pretty strong. And I don't think you're going to do necessarily a lot of harm by having a pretty general understanding of the different ages and the kind of, sort of Piagetian, for instance, or even Kohlbergian sort of development through, in terms of the way that Waldorf understands it. I think, it may be like any system can be over reified, and they need to always be in conversation with the fact that there are other systems and there are other frameworks. But, as people like Ken Wilber have showed, I think pretty effectively, there's a lot of overlaps to these systems. There are meaningful, valid, relevant overlaps to different developmental schemas. And that's because there is a territory that people are traversing, and that patterns that we're all sort of playing out are very shared in some way. So I think some basic acknowledgement of that, even if there's fluidity and flexibility on like which framework a particular school is using, just honoring the fact that you treat 2-year-olds different than 6-year-olds, different than 10-year-olds, different than 13-year-olds. In general, I think that's okay. I think what it really gets tricky is high school and college, you're dealing with a wide range of perspectives, and the sort of cohort system is going to start to break down more.
I like your answer because you're bringing in a developmental approach to the way we segment developmental cohorts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's a really good, because most 2-year-olds are roughly going to be hit the same mark, but most 16-year-olds, not so much. And the more complexity is present in the educational system and their social experiences and their cognition, the more those age levels and developmental levels are going to depart.
Yeah. And in order to deal with that, we need, again, high schools and colleges and beyond that. Again, actually, the stakes get higher and higher. The task demands to be an effective educator get higher and higher. By that same principle, it would be actually much easier to be an educator of young children in that sense, that you can basically have a general understanding of what's relevant and meaningful and appropriate for that age group. But to be an effective high school, college, and beyond educator, you would need a much more sophisticated and complex understanding of the possibility space of different perspectives. And it almost presumes that, like, if you're teaching young children, it's a pretty safe assumption that you've moved through those stages, and wherever perspective you're coming from, it's beyond that of a 12-year-old. You've gone through those stages, therefore you can help operate on and guide the people who have not gone through those stages yet. But when you're working with adolescents and college kids and beyond, it's actually not as safe as an assumption that the teacher has already traversed the territory that their students are moving through. And it's often the case that you have students who are in some skills and capacities at a level at or beyond the teacher. So that really problematizes it, is you can't even assume the appropriate, justified, natural, pedagogically appropriate hierarchy between teacher and student. And that sort of teacherly authority is in question in a legitimate way.
Yeah. And in both in terms of figuring out where it actually operates, and in terms of expecting people who are more complex to adequately challenge and expect more autonomy apart from the teacherly authority as they go forward.
Yeah.
There's also a tremendous, in a way, a perverse kind of way, generosity to what you were saying, because I've been thinking about the kids I knew in high school who wanted to be teachers or cops. And at the time I thought, I definitely don't want being a police officer. And I think you just want to be an oppressive pretend mom to a bunch of little kids.
Mm-hmm.
I was worried because I thought, if we're self-selecting for this, we might be getting the wrong people, definitely. But if we think of the teachers of young children as having a much higher likelihood of having traversed in some successful way those early developmental levels, then we don't have to expect as much from them because there's so much built in already. and it only becomes really complicated and problematic a little further down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I say this as an early childhood educator. It's relatively simple. The biggest problem is that we overcomplicate it, and we often try to do too much, and we lose sight of the basic simplicity of secure attachment, love, safety, freedom, play, joy, arts, creativity, Yeah.
This conversation is far from exhausted, but I'm out of questions. Is there anything else we should talk about?
Well, we covered a good range. I think this is a pretty good summary. I appreciate the inquiry as a chance for me to flesh out things that I think about a lot, but don't necessarily talk about a lot.
Well, that's good. Yeah, we're thinking at the integral stage that education is going to be one of the central issues that we should be focusing on. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to start this series up. We've got 2 or 3 interviews in it now. So we'll probably want to come back to you and check in periodically, because I do think it's the choke point or leverage point for all of the range of accumulating convergent crises that we're facing. If we can't solve the education problem, we can't solve any of the problems.
Yeah. It's so true. And the more we see that and acknowledge that and are thinking about that, the more progress we can make. I mean, the meta crisis is an educational crisis. And as we can see in our conversation, I mean, we touched on everything. It connects to everything, and it's all connected. And we have to keep unpacking and sort of fleshing out really what all the implications are. And at the same time, hopefully come to relatively hopeful and optimistic feelings about what's possible, at least at a small scale. There are also things that are relatively simple and common sense and straightforward that we can do and that people are doing. And there are a lot of beautiful, amazing people who are actually coming along just fine right now, even in 2021. So it's important to not lose sight of that.
Beautiful, man. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Layman. So good to talk to you.